Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Riley with System Source, joined by Dennis Kloster, who's one of our senior consultants. And we want to welcome you to today's presentation, because we're going to dive into some alternatives for VMware. You might have never thought that you would need an alternative for VMware, but we're going to take a look at that today, kind of thanks to Broadcom's massive price increases. So we have many clients that are looking at alternatives going forward for VMware. And today we'll start taking a look at some of those for you. We also have one in 2 weeks on Tuesday the 30th, which will continue this conversation. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. So let's kind of dig in a little bit to the agenda here, and we'll then keep moving right along. So just a few introductory remarks by me, and then Dennis will jump right in. He'll first kind of review where are we, what's the situation with Broadcom's pricing, policy changes, et cetera, and why that's really incented so many people to start looking at alternatives to VMware. And so if you're in that boat, which most of you probably are, you're in the right place. So giving yourself time to be able to properly plan, budget, and do the transitions, educate yourself, those types of things are all important, and giving yourself time to do that's very important. So Dennis, today we'll be looking into a number of different alternatives: Hyper-V, Azure Local, Azure Cloud, and HPE Essentials. And on the Azure Cloud side, that will be one that we will do a high-level piece on today, but on Tuesday the 30th, we're going to deep dive into the options of migrating to Azure Cloud. So today we're going to be looking at principally on-prem options, so moving from VMware on-prem to other various on-prem options, and touching on the Azure Cloud piece, and then in a little bit less than 2 weeks, then we'll deep dive into the Azure Cloud piece as well. So just kind of giving you a little bit of lay of the land coming up. All right, a little bit of housekeeping here. So the first thing is, hopefully you have a pizza in front of you if you asked for one. However, if the pizza has not arrived yet, please be a little bit patient. The driver may be able to find your office, your home office. Sometimes if you have a locked door in your office to the lobby area, you may want to check that. They may be on the other side of that locked door. However, if you still don't have a pizza here shortly, please just note Julie Dellinger's email address on the screen, and just reach out to her. She'll be happy to try to give you a hand. A little bit more housekeeping, a little bit of background. First, audio will be in presentation mode. You can hear us, but sadly we can't hear you. But we do that so that any background noise where participants may be doesn't come through to the whole group. However, you can share your thoughts with me through the chat tab at any point during the webinar. You can submit questions right through the questions tab. We'll save questions to the end, and I'll read those out to Dennis, and then he can reply to them then. Putting them in writing also has the advantage, if it's something more involved or very specific to your environment, we can respond to you afterwards as well. We want to keep this educational, make sure that you get good information and good responses to your questions. So just jot those right into the questions tab. Whenever you think about it, we'll save them right to the end. You'll get this presentation, also a link to the recording later on today, so you'll have that. You don't have to write furiously. And then finally, there's an evaluation at the end that you'll get at the conclusion of the webinar. If you could take a moment, just fill that out. Let us know how we did, any other resources that you may need that will kind of help you on your planning journey for this important topic, any other information that you have for us. We do look carefully at these because it helps us to do better and helps us to give you information on topics that you request and that you need. And we try to make it a little bit more fun because there's a $50 Amazon gift card we'll pull out for one of the completed evaluations. Hope that's you. Most of you are familiar with System Source, but just very briefly kind of around the System Source wheel, as we call it. So we've been around since 1981. And now into almost our 44th year at this point at System Source, thanks to folks like you. And we appreciate that, obviously, very, very deeply. So a lot of folks come to us when they first need to acquire technology, and that can be either on in-user computing side, or most of the time, and most of the work that we do is on the data center side. So whether that's on-prem, and we'll be looking at kind of like on-prem options today for VMware for virtualization hypervisors, or on the cloud side, Azure, AWS, all the other kinds of places, from software as a service to hosting facilities to colo facilities, other places that you may have computing devices, compute, storage, networking, etc. We work on all of those types of sides. So folks acquire because they really want to improve. So we talked a little bit about consulting and cloud. We also have our training department, which has hundreds and hundreds of courses available at any one point on all the topics that we're talking about today, plus about 2 or 3 other dozen, both technical topics or manufacturer partner specific, like Cisco, Microsoft, etc. And those are all available remotely. Where it says present is professional AV, things like Teams rooms, Zoom rooms, WebEx rooms, all the monitors, microphones, cameras, installation of those types of equipment, including integrating it into furniture, all those types of things, is done by our professional AV group. And then finally, we support all these things either on a you call us when you need it basis on service and support, it's kind of a reactive basis, or managed services where it's a proactive piece because we're the IT department for many dozens of clients throughout the area. And that's a little bit about System Source today. We appreciate your listening there. And then finally, we do have a couple other upcoming webinars. The first one I've already mentioned, which is kind of that cloud variant of an option where you could go for as an alternative to VMware. And then coming up on the 7th of October is from our AV group, looking at Teams rooms. How do you kind of build those kinds of spaces for Teams communication using Microsoft Teams? And then finally, I think we're all set for Dennis, please.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So the first thing we want to talk about is why are we even having this conversation? Why is everybody here listening to me? So I'll kind of go over this in a relatively short amount of time, and I assume most of you are probably already aware at least some of this. So Broadcom purchased VMware a year or two ago, and they kind of immediately made some changes, and then they've subsequently made more changes and more changes and more changes. And I think a lot of people seem to think that these changes are basically trying to figure out how much they can get away with. So the first thing they did was they switched from a perpetual license to a subscription-based model. So basically, you used to own your license, and then you paid for the service and support on that license, the right to contact VMware for support, the right to upgrade to the newest version if your support was up to date. Now they went to a subscription base, so similar to Office 365 or Netflix or anything like that. You own the license, or you rent the license, or lease the license, depending on how to look for it, as long as you continue to pay them. So you don't technically own the license anymore. That obviously upset a lot of people. Then they went ahead and said, gee, we have too many product offerings. Let's consolidate that down. And when they did that, they kind of just start to show their hand, to use a poker term, because what they did was they eliminated the most common, the most effective product offerings / licenses that were used by most of the small and medium-sized client offerings. So things like the Essentials Plus, which was by far and away our most common with most of our clients. I would probably say maybe 85 to 90% of our clients use that. That went away. That offering went away, and what they're doing is they're forcing people, whether they need it or not, to go to their enterprise level licensing, which offers all kinds of wonderful technical. I'm not putting it down. There's some great technical products and solutions that are now available, but if you don't need them and it's overkill because you're a smaller size customer, then who cares? They also increased the CPU core requirements, so that whether you need them or not, you need to pay for a whole bunch of CPU cores. And probably that fourth bullet point is probably the most frustrating / challenging. They have shown a complete unwillingness to negotiate. So if you try to go to them, or you try to get somebody like System Source to go on your behalf and say, hey, they've been a loyal customer for X amount of years, and they only need this, and they're a nonprofit, and they blah blah blah. They don't care. They will basically come back and say, this is your cost. And that fifth bullet point, kind of says it all. So there have been massive cost increases. Almost all clients have seen a 5x or more cost increase. Some people it's been as high as 1,500%. So up, a 15x cost increase because they've increased the base cost and then eliminated the most common options. So you're now being forced to say, okay, the product that I was owning before is no longer available. The price has been raised for everything, and now I have to go up, multiple levels because they eliminated my small to medium size offering that I was using, and now I have to go to some enterprise thing. And at the end of the day, over a 3-year period or a 5-year period, whatever, it's costing me, 8x or 10x or whatever the amount is. So between the cost increase as well as the general kind of, for lack of a better term, we don't care attitude that Broadcom is showing, a lot of people are looking for VMware alternatives. And so that's what this conversation is going to be about is, okay, like what are the alternatives out there? And there are a lot of them. So at a high level, I'm just going to talk about, hey, if you're one of those people and you're upset with VMware and you're looking for alternatives, at a very high level, there's some things you have to think about. A, there's lots of on-premise hypervisor solutions, and B, there's lots of cloud-based solutions. So A, picking, do I want to go local hypervisor, on-prem hypervisor, or B, do I want to go cloud-based? And then where do you go from there? Because there's lots of options. So if you're migrating to an on-prem solution, you're going to need additional server hardware, additional storage, perhaps additional software/licensing costs. If you're going to specifically Hyper-V, which I will say most of our clients have been moving, if they've been moving from VMware, we have lots of people planning, we have lots of people talking about, but depending on where you're at in your subscription with VMware, you may have another 6 months or a year, in some cases 2 years or more, to make the decision. But if you're going to make that move, most of our clients have been moving to Hyper-V because it's honestly, it has the second biggest footprint behind VMware. It's been around for a long time. We do have clients that have been running VMware for over a decade. I'm sorry, running Hyper-V for over a decade. However, if you're switching from a VMware ESXi and going to Hyper-V, it is another Windows server to manage. So things like antivirus and whatever management software you're using, if you're using some type of management software, do you have to put an agent on that? Is it going to cost you money? Are you going to put another antivirus agent? Then there's the Windows. It is a Windows server, which comes with inherent security risk compared to a ESXi hypervisor. Okay. Oop, I think I just skipped. Give me 1 second. All right. So now where I want to be. Okay. So if you're going to Azure specifically, and as Chris said, we're covering the VMware to Azure migration in much greater depth in 2 weeks or a week and a half on the 30th. I'm going to go over only because it is a feasible option, and some of the local options I'm going to talk about do have tie-ins to Azure. So with Azure, as with any other server migration, even if you just want to upgrade your servers from server 2019 to server 22 or something like that, you have two options. You can either build new VMs and then migrate the data and apps, which is what this is talking about, or you can just kind of migrate it as is. So build new and migrate data and apps. There's opportunities to consolidate. You're going to run the newest, latest, greatest operating system, whatever operating system you choose. It is a lot more complicated. So it says can reduce the Azure cost, but the migration costs are typically going to be higher because of the amount of manual work that needs to be done. It does take more time and more planning. Azure Migrate is a tool that's used for as-is migration. So if you're just want to take your VM that's running on VMware or it's on-prem, or I'm sorry, a local server, and then it's used for as-is migration. And then Azure has a tool called Site Recovery, which is primarily a DR tool, but it does replicate your VM from VMware, or again, if it's a an actual physical on-prem server, it can migrate it to DR, which in this case you could then use as a way to get your stuff into Azure. All right, so Azure Migrate, as I said, it can be used for VMware, Hyper-V, or physical servers. It has 4 basic steps, which we'll go over here in a second. The first is discovery and assessment tool. So it goes out, it's typically an appliance that you would install. So if you're running VMware, you would install the appliance on your VMware host or on your VMware cluster, and it goes out and finds what you have. Then it's going to come through and do sizing and say, okay, so this virtual machine, let's just pretend it's VMware, this virtual machine, has 4 virtual CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM and 200 gigabyte hard disk. In the Azure world, this is what the configuration would look like, and this is going to be an estimate for cost. And then it's going to go over and look if there's other dependencies that are going to cause issues. So as I said, it's a lightweight Azure appliance, can run on a physical server if you're not running VMware, but since in this case we're talking about VMware, you'd run it there. It's agentless, which is really nice. So all you do is just install the appliance. You don't have to install anything on your existing physical servers or your VMs. So here's the example. You create a project, and the project, you then download and install the OVA, which is the appliance file for VMware. It registers. Then it starts a continuous discovery. So, every day, every hour you can schedule it. It's going to go through and look for new servers. And then it's going to do an assessment where it's going to come back and tell you, this is what I found. Some of these may or may not be ready to move to Azure. Here's risk, cost, and cost is probably the biggest thing, because anybody who's ever looked at a potential migration, whether it's to Azure or AWS or anywhere else, trying to actually figure out the monthly cost is not as easy as you would think. So it is nice that it does come back with this. You can review the results. Okay, this is what it looks like. And then you do your migration where you replicate your data. Then you can do, when you're ready, so then you would replicate your data to Azure. All kinds of different options you have. Monitor your replication, and then when when it's done replicating all of your VMware data to Azure, you can actually do a test migration. So obviously, you kind of run it in a self-contained network so that you don't have duplicate IPs and changes to data, your file server that you just migrated to Azure and locally. But it's kind of neat that it has that ability to do all of that and do a test migration. And then when you're done, you hit the migrate button and it actually goes live. So that is the built-in Azure way to migrate your data from VMware to Azure. There are third-party tools out there. And in a second, when we talk about Hyper-V, I'm going to talk about some of the tools that are available. And then there's also third-party tools to get your stuff to Azure. All right, at a really high level, Microsoft's kind of cloud services. So if we look here at infrastructure as a service, we see servers and storage. And this is where your virtual machine. So when we talk about Azure, what we're typically talking about, most people, what they're thinking of is running VMs in running VMs in Microsoft's cloud, which is going to be Azure. So it's VMs, storage, networking, and such. Platform as a service is Azure SQL, Azure Files, and honestly, probably 100 other different platform as a service offerings. But here's where you can say, okay, I'm running my file server is a VMware VM, and I don't want to run VMware anymore. So I could take my file server exactly the way it is, and I could migrate it up to Azure, or I could migrate it over to Hyper-V, or I could use a hosted platform as a service, which in this case would be Azure Files, where I'm migrating my file server structure into Azure, but it's not running on a VM. So I don't have to worry about managing the VM and patching it. I'm using the platform, the file service sharing platform. And in some cases it's cheaper. The management is a little bit different, which is why this is probably not caught on as quickly as Microsoft would have liked. Because people, let's be honest, we don't inherently love change. If we're moving from on-prem to cloud, that's a big change already. Now, if I'm no longer managing it via a Windows server, it's another change. It is an option out there. Same thing with SQL. Instead of migrating my SQL server from VMware to either Hyper-V or Azure or some other option, I can use the hosted SQL platform service as well. And in those cases, is it a little bit cheaper, but like I said, it is a bigger change. And then software as a service, you guys are probably all using today because Microsoft 365 is the best example. And at this point, pretty much everybody has some sort of presence with 365. All right, just at a real high level, just kind of what Azure is. So there's 60 regions, there's 300 plus data centers. The cost, it becomes basically you're shifting from a capital expense to an operating expense. Savings, maybe this is kind of where your costs may vary because it's, there's a whole lot of hidden costs and soft costs, and it kind of depends where you put those. One of the biggest advantages of going to any hosted solutions is that your latest technologies and up-to-date versions. So Microsoft is behind the scenes upgrading things, and those upgrades don't necessarily affect you. So you don't have to worry about, oh man, VMware just came up with a new update, I have to install it, because Microsoft handles all of that in the Azure data centers. The downside is you don't have control over what Microsoft's doing all the time. To support the mobile geographically separated workforce, integration with cloud and on-prem. So most people typically have some type of VPN in place connecting their local office and local data center to the Azure cloud. So resiliency, there's multi-data center configuration options, multiple zones inside of that. Basically, what you're really getting is you're getting enterprise level availability, enterprise level disaster recovery capability without having to pay for it. So if you're a small company, you have, I don't know, 30 employees in one data center, but your data is very valuable to you. Now you can have your data stored here in multiple locations throughout the world. So when you pick your storage in Azure, you have the ability to do locally redundant storage, zone redundant storage, and geo redundant storage. And it's basically how many copies of my data do I want and how well distributed do I want it. And obviously there is a cost for a lot of this. So, the best option is the most expensive. All right, as we talked about with any of this, whether it's Azure, whether it's Hyper-V, whether it's whatever, the big question is migrate as is or build new. The two most important decisions you're going to make if you've decided I'm going to migrate away from VMware. Number one is going to be, where am I migrating to? Am I going to the cloud? Am I going to Azure? Am I going to AWS or some other cloud? Or am I going local on-prem? Am I going to go with Hyper-V or HPE's VM Essentials or something else? That's going to be your biggest decision. Your second decision is going to be, am I going to migrate as is or build new? And it doesn't have to be the same answer for all of them. You can do this on a VM by VM basis. So some of them you say, hey, I'm going to migrate as is. I'm going to take the virtual machine from VMware. I'm going to use some type of tool, and I'm going to migrate it to Hyper-V, or I'm going to migrate it to Azure, whatever you chose. And then some of them you might say, you know what? It's running an old operating system. I need to upgrade the operating system anyways, so we're going to build new VMs. And like I said, what's nice is it's not an all or nothing. You can cherry pick and say, some of these I'm going to migrate as is, some I'm going to build new. All right, let's talk about Hyper-V. So we talked about Azure, and as I said, we're in 12 days we're doing a much deeper deep dive into Azure. Let's talk about Hyper-V. Let's talk about local options for those of you that are not ready to move things out into the cloud yet. Why consider Hyper-V? The biggest reason is Hyper-V has been around of all of the other VMware non-VMware options. Hyper-V has been around for a very long time. It's not Gen 1, it's not Gen 2, it's not Gen 3, okay? And it has the second highest market share. So it's been around for a long time and it's proven. There's literally millions of VMs that have already been running on Hyper-V. The first bullet point is true. So for the foreseeable future, most businesses are going to continue to need some sort of resources on-prem, okay? I'm in the middle of a project right now where we are migrating from VMware to Azure, but there's a few things that they need to have on-prem. So we're going from multiple VMware hosts to a single Hyper-V host that's just going to run 2 or 3 VMs for things that like absolutely need to be on-prem. So it's, they're going to be a mix of Hyper-V and Azure. And that's what my guess is a lot of people are going to do. The good news is if you own Windows Server licensing, you already have Hyper-V. It's literally just a role to enable. If you have data center licensing as opposed to standard Windows Server licensing, data center allows unlimited guest VMs. Largest market share for VMware, as I said, and then Hyper-V supports a variety of guest OSs. The knock on Hyper-V when it first came out was it really only, when it first came out, I think it only supported Windows and Red Hat. Now it supports just about anything. Most vendors that provide the prepackaged appliances, Cisco with their FMC, they have an appliance for VMware and they have an appliance for Hyper-V. So if you're having these vendor-specific prepackaged appliances, by now they all are supporting Hyper-V. All right, so if you're going to migrate from VMware to Hyper-V, this bullet point says it's going to require hardware. And that is true with one caveat. So when we say require hardware, we mean buy hardware. Now, if you have a well-planned, well-thought-out VMware environment so that you have excess capacity, meaning you have a 4-server VMware cluster, a 6-server, a 3-server, whatever, but the utilization is like 50% or below, you can probably pull one of your VMware hosts out of the VMware cluster, wipe it, install Hyper-V on it, and go from there. Now, that's this bullet point. That says compute and storage, because what I just said is true, but it doesn't address storage. So most people have a SAN of some kind, right? Whether it's a Nimble or Electra or Equalogic, whatever brand it is you have, that your VMs are not running on local storage, they're running on centralized shared storage, i.e. a SAN. You also then have to have excess space on your SAN because we are moving these VMs from a VMware VMDK format to in this case, the Hyper-V VHDX format. So it is going to take more storage. Do you have to have, if you have 2 terabytes of VMware storage, do you have to have an extra 2 terabytes for Hyper-V? It depends on what your, how quickly you want to do this, what your risk tolerance is, because to make it really simple, if you had 2 terabytes of VMware storage and this is not realistic, but just for math's sake, let's just pretend you had 8 VMs that were exactly 250 gigs each, that gets you to 2 terabytes. You could, in theory, only need, 500 gigs if you moved 1 VM over at a time to Hyper-V, let it sit for a little bit. Once you're comfortable it worked, delete it off the SAN from VMware. So you don't need the exact amount. A lot of it's going to come down to your risk tolerance threshold. Are you going to be comfortable deleting the VM from VMware after you've migrated it in a couple days, a couple hours, a couple weeks? Like, what's that look like? Okay, so some tools. How do I get from VMware to Hyper-V? First bullet point says Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter. It's a free standalone tool. Microsoft, that'll be the first thing they tell you. However, this tool has not been updated, I think, since 2018, and as of 2020, even though Microsoft still puts it out there, it's not really supported. It will not work with any of the newer operating systems. So it's probably not the option, even though Microsoft will tell you it is. Veeam backup and replication is an option. You can back up your VMs and then restore them over to Hyper-V. If you have System Center Virtual Machine Manager, VMM, it's a management tool that has a built-in conversion feature. However, VMM costs money. It is not included, with Hyper-V, it's not included with your Windows license. There is an associated cost with it, and it is a pretty complex. It's not the same as vCenter in the VMware world. It's not something that takes a little bit of time to set up and then you kind of click through it. And I always tell most people, vCenter, you can probably figure out everything you needed to know on your own, or with me for half an hour of showing you what to do. VMM is not like that. It's probably a 2-day install maybe to get it working. It has very specific requirements of a SQL, and it's not as intuitive. So most people don't use that. The tool that I did not put on there that I have been using is a product from a company called Starwind, all one word, Starwind, and they have a V2V product, and it's free, and it works phenomenally. That's my go-to when I migrate from Hyper-V, from VMware to Hyper-V, although you certainly can go the opposite way and go Hyper-V to VMware. But it's the downside to it is it's free. And with free, that means your support is, go on the forums. But I've never had issues and never even really needed to. It just works. I mean, it's very, very, very similar looking to VMware's converter back in the P2V days. Kind of looks like that. Okay, so an Azure migration, what we're talking about here is this hybrid cloud. So it says here, Azure Arc provides centralized management from the Azure portal. So the idea is your goal is eventually to get your VMs running up in Azure. But as we said, most people still have needs for some things on-prem, plus a migration to Azure is not something that you just flip the switch on. Most people will do it a VM or two at a time. If you have 15, 20, 50, 100, 500 VMs, that migration to Azure is probably going to take quite a bit of time. So the idea is you can use Azure Arc, which is a software that basically can allow, click through this, that can allow you to manage multiple resources. So in this case, we have our Azure Arc software up in the cloud, and it's measuring VMs and containers and apps from AWS and Oracle, and then we have some on-prem Arc-enabled services from Microsoft, and we've got some VMware services, and we've got all kinds of different things. And Azure Arc is the control plane that's allowing us to manage all of these different things. And so the idea is that Azure Arc allows me to manage my Hyper-V servers as if it's another location in Azure. So when I create a VM in Azure, create anything in Azure, I have to pick basically where's it going to run. Is it going to run in the Northeast? Is it going to run, somewhere else in the world? Is it going to run somewhere else in the US? You're picking a data center. And so the Azure Arc makes your local on-prem, in most cases Hyper-V, look like it's another location. And so some of the features it allows is I can do guest operating system updates, i.e. hot patching. I can do more the same. So with Azure, you get a lot of built-in visibility into what's going on with your Azure VMs. So I can look at health, performance, events that are much, much greater and easier to use, quite honestly, than the Microsoft Event Viewer. I can now enable that on my Arc resources. I can do auto manage. So automatically onboarding and configuring, monitoring virtual machines with whatever your configuration profile is. So, in this case, the people have created one called production. So maybe they have, some type of management software automatically deployed, antivirus, whatever the case may be. So you can enable that auto manage feature. And then it says, Azure Local is the next step in integration. So basically take your Hyper-V servers and allow them to be managed the way that Azure is, so that as you move your resources into Azure, you're already familiar with the operating system. Now, Azure Local is a little bit different. Azure Local is basically a pre-bundled, you can almost think of it like it's hyper-converged, where you're buying the hardware, in this case, let's just say from HPE, we're buying a hardware bundle from HPE that has the Azure Local / Azure Arc integration built into it. So when you power it up, it walks you through a little wizard. It's turning on Hyper-V onto the host, it's provisioning the storage, and it's setting up your connection to Azure Arc. Azure Local is, if you buy that, you kind of buy it as a SKU or as a bundle. And so it has to run on specific hardware that's been similar to any other hyperconverged ideas, where it has to be, basically stamped with the approval from both the hardware vendor and Microsoft. So if that's something you're interested in, you could go look on HPE's website and look for Azure Local certified hardware bundles. All right, let me click through here. And as I said, it's seen as a custom location in Azure. This is a really, really cool feature for people that their long-term goal, whatever you define long-term as, is to run your VMs in Azure, but it's not going to be a quick migration. It's going to take some time. And in the short term, you don't want to run VMware. So you're going to migrate your on-prem VMs from VMware to Hyper-V, and then you're going to use the Azure Arc or Azure Local so that you can start getting familiar with Azure, so that you manage everything the same. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is another on-prem option, although this again has a lot of ties to the cloud. In this case, it's HPE's cloud. So a couple things about this. This is HPE's Private Cloud Business Edition. It is a relatively new, and especially new to HPE, offering. When I say relatively new to HPE, because a lot of this software, the technology, the products, some of it was developed in-house by HPE, but some of it was from a purchase, Morpheus being the big one, where they purchased Morpheus and kind of integrated that as kind of the backbone to what this is. Okay, so HPE, first thing it says is GreenLake Cloud. If you're not familiar with what GreenLake is HPE's cloud endeavor. So if you buy a new storage, brand new server from HPE, or even networking, but I'll just stick to storage and compute now. One of the things that in the storage world, they force you to register your storage with HPE GreenLake. HPE GreenLake is HPE's cloud, and they're kind of leveraging their entire future on it, quite honestly, because their goal is we can do all types of management of our on-prem and cloud devices from here. So there's a storage-based option inside of HPE GreenLake, and then there's the server-based. So if anybody's bought one of the new servers, one of the things that's going to not force you to do, but you're paying for it, might as well use it, is use HPE Compute Ops, where your servers are using the ILO card and ILO features to make a secure connection to GreenLake, and you can manage your servers from GreenLake. So I can log in from anywhere to the GreenLake cloud, and the best, most useful function I have found with this is the ability to update ILO firmware and update the actual firmware of the server itself with a click of the mouse, which, if anybody's managed HPE servers before, updating firmware and ILO firmware is not always the most simple thing. Trying to find the right software, quite honestly, sometimes involved rain dances and all types of other things, because it is not simple to find. So that's a really cool feature. But anyways, GreenLake as a whole is this big cloud thing that allows you to look down and look into HPE servers, HPE networking devices, HPE storage, as well as public cloud and things, AWS, the Google Cloud. It talks about brownfield and greenfield. Those are terms in the HPE world. So what you're basically talking about is using hyperconverged, where there's a simple management phase where I manage my storage, I manage my networking, and I manage my servers, as opposed to having 3 different management phases. Brownfield refers to reusing existing hardware and then putting on that hyperconverged management in front of it. It could be a mixture of some new stuff, but some old, or all old. Greenfield is everything is new. So I go out and I buy from HP, some bundle that has 4 servers and 10 terabytes of Electra storage and new Aruba switches, and now it's got a different interface and a wizard that walks me through it, and I manage it different. So that's what brownfield and greenfield are. So here's the HPE GreenLake Cloud, and what we're going to talk about, I kind of already went through this. The hyperconverged infrastructure, or HCI, is the big term, and it can be all-in-one HCI, which is everything is bundled into the hyperconverged, my storage, my networking, my server, compute, and then there's also disaggregated HCI, which is literally the way we've done server storage and networking in the past, where it's not all bundled together. I have no idea why we have to use fancy terms for things that we've always been doing forever, but that's the world we live in today. All right, so HPE Private Cloud Business Edition. What it is the Private Cloud Business Edition is a cloud console that allows you to manage your virtual infrastructure, whether it's VMware or running on Morpheus/VM Essentials, which is how they refer to this HPE hypervisor. So the Private Cloud Business Edition is kind of the cloud-based software that manages this. And when we refer to Morpheus or VM Essentials, we're talking about the hypervisor. And so here's all their components and terminology of what they're calling the stack. The things to kind of note here, as I said, the Private Cloud Business Edition, the Electra is the storage, the Proliant is the server. We talked about the next 2, Morpheus and the HPE VM hypervisor. The other things are the VM Essentials Manager, which is a management VM for VM Essentials. In the VMware world, you would say this is the equivalent to vCenter. So it's kind of the management VM. And then the Data Service Connector, or DSC VM, is just a VM that provides basically a secure tunnel from your on-prem to the Private Cloud Business Edition. So basically, it's providing the secure tunnel to communicate back to GreenLake. All right, so what does this all look like? So in this case, we have a HPE Electra down at the bottom, hyperconverged infrastructure. So all my servers, all my storage, all of my networking is built into this hyperconverged product, right? It's, in this case, it's behind its distinct products, you can see, but that's running on-prem. We have our data services connector, which is providing the secure tunnel. And then from there, we're doing all of our management via the cloud. This can run, and now I'm just going to give a couple different examples of what this looks like. So this can run in a whole bunch of different ways. So in this case, we have a VMware and the HPE private cloud running together. So here we have a vCenter, we have a VM Essentials Manager. We're running the vCenter is actually running on VM Essentials, so it's not running on the vSphere. Underneath it, we have a vSphere cluster. Then underneath that, it talks about specific models of HPE stuff. We're not going to get into that. So that's what that looks like. Here's another one where our vSphere cluster is completely separate from our VM Essentials software. So it's 2 completely separate clusters that may or may not, in this case, it says it is running on a shared storage. So they're both running on the Electra same SAN. It could be separate SANs though. But the idea is that this Private Cloud Business Edition, it's kind of similar concept to the Azure Local or the Azure Arc. My goal in this case, instead of migrating from VMware to Hyper-V, is my goal is to migrate from VMware to the HPE VM Essentials. But again, it's not realistic to think this is going to happen overnight. So in this case, we have some of our stuff still running on VMware, some of our stuff still running, or some of our new stuff now running in the HPE VM Essentials world, but we're managing it all from the HPE VM Essentials, similar to like we talked about with the Azure Arc / or Azure Local. If my goal is to get to Azure, let's get familiar with that interface right off the bat, even if most of our VMs are running on Hyper-V locally. Same thing here. Let's get familiar with the HPE Private Cloud Business Edition cloud, the management software, even while the majority of our stuff is running on VMware. All right, that is all I have. And I know I went through a whole bunch and I went through them very fast. So if anybody has any questions, the one thing I'll say actually before I turn it over to questions, just to be completely upfront, the HPE VM Essentials, I think in the mid to long term is going to be a player. HPE has invested a ton of money and a ton of resources into this. They're not gonna cancel this in a year. The caveat and the reason I bring that up is one of the gating criteria that we have at System Source for both our managed service customers and just for our clients that we do projects for and we advise and just help them get to where we think is a good place. One of the things that we talk about is the importance of backups. And whether it's because your building burns down or ransomware, whatever the case may be, obviously I think everybody understands backups are really, really important. As it stands today, HPE VM Essentials is not supported with Veeam or Barracuda or some of the what we consider the best of the best backup brands. They have their own backup software built into it. So it's basically behind the scenes. They're using snapshots. In a lot of cases, snapshots are better than backups because snapshots typically are inherently locked and they can't be changed the way backups can. So typically they're inherently immutable. However, it's using its own backup software, and there's a reason why people didn't use NT backup for years with Windows servers. We use something else. HPE will say that they work with Veeam, and they do, because if you put an agent in the virtual machines, it'll back it up like it's a physical Windows server. But that's not the same as backing it up at the virtual hard drive level, where in the event that you lost a server, you would just restore the virtual hard drive the way that you can with Hyper-V or the way you can with VMware. So I do want to be very upfront. We are extremely interested in keeping an eye on the HPE VM Essentials / Morpheus / whatever term you want to use for the product offering. And I do think in the mid to long term, it's going to be a major player. But as of today, that is holding it back. That and the fact that it's just not as, it doesn't have the history and the millions of VMs that are running on Azure, AWS, VMware, Hyper-V. So it is, much younger and less mature. So I just want to be very upfront about that. I think it's going to be a major player, but it's not yet today. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to, I don't know if there's any questions or anything, Chris.
Sure, yes, we have a couple different questions here. So the first one is, have you seen instances where a Microsoft upgrade to Azure environment has broken a client's server / system? If so, how often does that happen?
So what's nice is because there's that, if you're using the Azure migrate tool, there's a test. And so with all of this, none of the processes involve making any changes to the source VM. So there's always, assuming that the problems happen somewhat immediately, which 99% of the time they do, you just power the VM off, whether it's in Azure or Hyper-V or wherever, and you just go back to the new one. But again, because there's that test feature, you should know ahead of time if there's going to be an issue. We have not had any issues that I'm aware of migrating from Azure or migrating to Hyper-V.
Second question is, why not Proxmox? I run StarWinds HCI with VMware now, but planning on going to Proxmox.
So we have looked at Proxmox. So Proxmox, for those of you that are not available, is another alternative. So it's an alternative to Hyper-V. It's an alternative to HPE VM Essentials. One of the reasons why we have not went really deep, we've played around with it, we've looked into it, I think we've talked to them, is that they're a smaller company and support does become an option. So at the end of the day, if you are a network administrator and you are, responsible for what happens in your network, I would, for job security reasons, most people, do look into the level of support and and I'm not saying I have no bad experience with Proxmox support. I'll make that very clear. But I think just based on the size of their company, a lot of people are somewhat leery, even though I understand it works, it has wonderful features, and it's very attractive from a cost perspective. I think the only thing keeping it back right now is that it's not a huge company with a very big and robust support staff.
Then the next question is, we presently use Zerto for replication. If moving to Azure, what could be the equivalent?
So Azure has its own built-in options to keep your data in multiple locations. So the short answer is there's actually a lot of options. Once you start putting your stuff in a public cloud, where with literally a click of a button, you can have as many copies really as you want of your data. In addition, Azure now has, when I say now has, they've always had their own backup software, but it's gotten way better in the past year. So they have their own backup and DR replication offering that's now, I don't want to say built in because it's a separate product with a separate cost, but it's kind of right there in the VM when you're managing your VMs. It's right there. Matter of fact, if you set up a new VM from scratch now in Azure, one of the things it's going to ask you is about your backups and how you want to handle that, how many copies of your data. So the short answer is there's lots of options that give you kind of the same level of what Zerto gives you.
Those are all the questions that we have at this point. Thank you very much for those who submitted questions. We appreciate it. Thank you very much to Dennis for this information. Today, just to remind you, there is the evaluation that you'll get. On there are some options, and one of the options I just want to point out is what we just kind of called a free planning workshop or whiteboard session on migrating away from VMware to an alternative. So you may want to kind of deep dive a little bit more into which ones of these alternatives that we've talked about today or that we'll be talking about for the Azure Deep Dive a week from next Tuesday, for how that might apply in your unique environment. So this is an opportunity to kind of have that conversations with Dennis or one of his colleagues to kind of walk through that process and help select what would be an appropriate one for you, and then that can help start that planning process and those details there. So I just want to point that one out to you. Thank you again, everyone. We appreciate your time today, and hope you have a great rest of the afternoon. And thanks again to Dennis. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.